Welcome. My name is Andrew Politsky. I'm a student of history here at Westchester University. We are at Francis Harvey Green Library. I'm with Dr. Janneken Smucker. Dr. Smucker is an assistant professor of history at Westchester University, the president of the Quilt Alliance, a published author, and co-curator of The World Quilts the American Story, which is a project of the International Quilt Study Center and Museum at the University of Nebraska. Her book, featured right there, Amish Quilts, an American Icon, provides an in-depth history of Amish quilts and their growing business practices today. Without further ado, Dr. Smucker, how are you feeling?
Very well. Thank you so much for having me today.
You staying warm?
I am trying my best.
All right. First question: when did you become interested in quilting?
Well, I grew up with quilts around my house. My grandmother had made quite a few quilts on my mother's side of the family, and her mother had made even more quilts. And there were also quilts that on my dad's side of the family. So they were a common thing in my home. I grew up in northern Indiana in a Mennonite family. This is the kind of modern Mennonite family that we had. We drove cars and we had electricity and dressed like everybody else. But we were part of the long greater Anabaptist tradition of Mennonites and Amish, and many of my ancestors had come to North America as Amish in the 18th century. But by the late 19th century had become part of the Amish Mennonite Church and eventually just part of the Mennonite Church. So it was sort of ingrained in my own cultural heritage, this quilt making tradition. Mennonites didn't bring quilts with them from Europe, but they learned in the 19th century. So I was used to always having quilts around me as a child, slept under them, they were on the couches, and so forth. I learned to sew when I was pretty young, but it wasn't until I think I was around 16, one summer vacation. I was the kind of kid who always wanted a project to work on during summer, and I decided I was going to make a quilt. I pulled a book off my mom's shelf that was called How to Make a Sampler Quilt. She had made, I think, one quilt already at that point in her life. And a sampler is a kind of quilt where each of the blocks is a different pattern. And so I took off this book and I began to look at all the pattern options and chose all my favorites and had so much fun going to the fabric store, picking out the fabrics I wanted to use. And I knew how to sew, so it was something I could easily figure out, and I had a lot of help from my mom and my grandmother when I ran into stumbling blocks. And after that first quilt, I was really hooked. I finished that quilt around the time I went to college and continued making quilts while I was in college, even setting up a quilt frame in my college house when I lived off campus, and I'd invite friends over to help quilt on the big frame. It was my great-grandmother's frame, actually, that I had in my college house. But then after my friends would leave, I'd usually take out their quilting stitches because they were really bad. It was developed the pernickettiness of a real, true quilt maker.
So quilting has definitely been a part of your immediate family. Do you see it as a family tradition? Do you want to continue that tradition? Are you beginning to explore your daughter's interest in quilting? Is she interested in quilting?
Sure. I do see a real strong connection to my family heritage, and I think that's where a big part of the initial appeal was, that I was doing something that women in my family had done. I didn't even know at that point until I started studying quilts a little more seriously and talking to my grandmother a lot more, that we know that I'm at least a fifth generation quilt maker, and could go back further than that. And my daughter has expressed a lot of interest in quilts and quilt making. She really loves color and she loves pattern and design. She's helped, I've had squares that were already cut and she, likes to arrange them into a patchwork pattern. She's also helped me with some sewing quilt projects using a sewing machine. My sewing machine has one of those foot pedals, and so she'll press on the foot pedal and I'll say start and stop and that sort of thing. She's really interested in it. The last baby quilt I was working on, we laid out the pieces on the floor to try to figure out which block should go where, and Calla was really intuitive about figuring out how to space the different colors out, how to make it look very nice and balanced. and I think maybe the gene has been passed on to her as well.
How big is your quilt collection, and can you tell us a little bit about the one behind you?
Well, I would hesitate to even say that I have a quilt collection. I have some of the quilts that I've made myself. For about 20 years, I slept under the quilt, my first quilt, that sampler quilt that I made when I was a teenager. And then I have, I think, about 2 other full-size quilts that I've made also around my house. I've given quilts away. I've also sold quilts. There was a phase in my life where I thought maybe I would become a professional quilt maker, and I did some quilts on commission. I also own my grandmother's first quilt, as well as a quilt made by my great-great-grandmother. Also have a few other quilts that are still at my parents' house in Indiana that they say will go to me, which includes a mid-19th century crib quilt. I'm lucky enough to have received quilts as gifts as well. When my daughter was born, I think there were 3 separate baby quilts that were made for her, which was great since I kept intending to make one for her myself but never got around to it, so thankfully some other people beat me to it. So I definitely live with quilts. I don't really have the sort of collector's mentality that some quilt collectors really have, where they acquire a lot of quilts. I also, as part of my own scholarship and research, have studied quilt collecting, and so there's a certain amount of distance I think I have from that realm. I know a lot about the quilt market for antique quilts and just how overinflated it was, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and quilts have been far more expensive than I could own. That market is deflated to some degree now, but there's still, antique quilts are quite expensive. Even the materials that go into contemporary quilts are also quite expensive if you consider the materials and the labor as well.
In your opinion, do you think quilts leave lasting memories for you when you either make them or purchase one, or have them brought down from previous generations? Do they have lasting memories?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the really distinct things about quilts as objects of material culture, is that they tie us so closely to memories. Sometimes that's in like a very tangible form when you use a fabric in a quilt that was left over from another project or from making clothes, or sometimes it's the experiences you have had with a quilt over the years, or in the case of like owning my grandmother's first quilt she made, I always think about the time when she first showed it to me. And I actually did the first oral history interview I ever did about quilts was with my grandmother, and I interviewed her about when she was in her early 20s and made that first quilt. And it was very common among young women in her community in Eastern Ohio to all make quilts at that age, and I learned so much sort of about quilt making as kind of a convention of the young Mennonite women in the 1920s when she was growing up.
When you make quilts, where do your ideas come from? Are they from your emotions? From your experiences? Do you design them from like a place you've been? What you're feeling at that time?
I would say the biggest inspiration for me in my quilt making is historic quilts. I worked as the curatorial assistant at the International Quilt Study Center and Museum when I was a graduate student in textiles at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and they are home to the largest publicly held collection of quilts in the world, largely antique quilts, though they also collect contemporary art quilts. And through that work, I was exposed to literally thousands of historic quilts that I got to handle. One of the regular activities I did was with our volunteers every morning. We refolded quilts. They stored quilts in acid-free cardboard boxes in a state-of-the-art storage facility, climate-controlled facility. And quilts should be aired out and folded along different lines so that they don't develop really harsh crease lines.
Sounds like a process.
So this was like an ongoing thing. I would supervise our volunteers, which were usually like retired women, and we would unfold the quilts. I would do an object report usually on them, like get the measurements, make notes about any damage, notes about the fabrics that were being used, and those sorts of things, and then they would refold them, making sure it was on new lines so they wouldn't develop harsh crease lines. And so I looked at so many historic quilts that those are sort of like permeate my design sensibilities, and I can think of those designs when I'm making my own quilts. I'm definitely drawn to patchwork, which is sewing, it's piecing, where it's very geometric, rectangles, squares, triangles, rather than the applique. The quilt behind me has some applique as well as piecework on it. But a lot of what I really was inspired by was the historic quilts, and I like fairly simple patterns, very geometric, graphic designs. But rather than pour certain emotions into quilts, I think I'm more thinking graphically, really drawn to the historic patchwork quilts.
Which leads me to my next question. The quilt behind you. What do you like about this quilt? What kind of styles did you like about it? Did you like these patterns, the colors?
This was one of the first quilts I made intended as a wall hanging, sort of my first foray into kind of, it's sort of more of an art quilt, in that it's not a repeat block pattern patchwork quilt, which is more of the historic quilts that I was inspired by usually are. But I really liked the idea of kind of using this gradation of colors. This sort of has probably more symbolism than most quilts that I would make, and that we're going from the ground level to the sort of the earth, the grass,
Yeah, it looks like it's
and
a setting.
Then the sky and the sun setting. So, if anything, this was kind of a study in color, but colors drawn from nature. And the quilting stitches that I used on this sort of reflect that as well. In the grays and browns here at the bottom, it's like the roots of a tree, and then this is sort of vines that are growing up through the green section, and sort of waves of the ocean in the blue, and then
Are these all the materials you had lying around the house, or?
These were not. This was, I would say, probably a mixture of some leftover fabric from other projects. As I look at it now, I'm remembering some of the other things I did with these same fabrics, so it really ties into the question you asked earlier about how a quilt can hold memory. But some of these were, I think some of them were fabrics that I bought intentionally for this. This was probably maybe 17 years ago or so that I made this quilt.
As an expert in handling historical quilts and curating the project you are on, as president of the Quilt Alliance, when you work with these stories with people and their quilts, what is the biggest challenge in gathering these histories and curating them? Is it hard to compile everything? Is managing the website difficult? What are some of the biggest difficulties you face with that?
Well, as a board member and current president of the Quilt Alliance, I've really been involved in our oral history projects, which aim to document and preserve the stories of quilts and quilt makers. And along with the documenting, actually listening, recording these stories, we have become more and more determined to share them and make them accessible. And that's simultaneously become easier with new technologies, but also more challenging because of budgetary limitations, access to the technologies. So it's sort of this, the challenge really is in we have this mass of about 1,300 oral history interviews. And these were conducted largely with volunteers, usually quilt makers themselves, who are interviewing other quilt makers. And just like we are sitting here with a quilt, the interviewee would always bring a quilt with her or him, and that would be sort of the touchstone of the interview. So there's 1,300 some interviews that are documenting a specific quilt and a quilt maker, yet these are sat largely untouched because it's hard to dive into an interview and know what's in them. Many times, no one aside from the person who wrote the transcript has even, and the interviewee herself has read them perhaps, or it's hard to even say what kind of statistics. We don't have good statistics on that. But there's new technologies that are making the words of an interview accessible. As you all were working on using some of these technologies in class, the oral history metadata synchronizer allows you to search the transcript as well as an index that's created to go along with an interview, and you can find an exact moment where the interviewee is talking about Amish quilts, for example. So I think that is great. Getting to the point where you have 1,300 backlogs of interviews to make them have that degree of accessibility is quite a challenge. Many of these interviews were recorded on analog cassette tapes, so the first step for those is to get them digitized so that you have a digital audio file that can be synced up with the transcript, and someone can create an index to go along with that. It's none of these things have a terribly high learning curve, but when you're talking about that kind of quantity, it's building up you're really dealing with this large archive, moving towards greater access. I think we can achieve it, but it certainly is challenging.
It sounds like the advancements in technology are definitely helping distribute these histories and make it accessible for everyone with the OHM's indexing and other multimedia things that can help with
the technology absolutely helps. One of the obstacles is that we don't anticipate what the new technologies are going to be when we're creating these projects. So the Quilters SOS Save Our Stories oral history project was begun in 1999 and presumed at that time to be fairly cutting edge digitally, in that we published the full transcripts of each of the interviews on our website. Yet we didn't we archived the cassette tapes, but didn't really think about a future for those, of how those could be accessible and delivered to potential audiences digitally through the World Wide Web. It just wasn't part of our thinking in 1999. I say I was not involved in the organization then, but technology advances, and so you kind of have to play this catch-up. Well, how can we take what we've already done and sort of upgrade it and convert it to the new technologies? And we're doing that now, playing catch-up, but we don't even know what's going to be available in 5 years or 10 years. For example, speech recognition software is improving rapidly. Right now, it's at a place where if we to transcribe an oral history interview with speech recognition software, you could get a rough, maybe 80% accurate transcript, but you'd still have to have a human go back in and edit everything. So we don't really and can't know for sure. Well, what's the technological landscape in another 10 years?
Is there anything unique in regards to the history of quilt making?
There is a lot of fascinating things about the history of quilt making. I think quilts are a really wonderful window onto a lot of aspects of American culture of other societies as well, though I certainly have studied American culture most closely in terms of quilts, because they are this handmade, kind of seemingly handmade object. They're using the factory-made goods, the fabric, the thread, often the batting as well, and often using commercially published patterns. So they have sort of this handmade quality, and that's what we associate with quilts, these ideas of tradition and simplicity and authenticity, yet they also reflect this amazing history of industrialization. Quilt making on the scale that we have now, on the scale that we had in 1850, wouldn't be possible without the Industrial Revolution. generating lots of cheap, abundantly available fabric that could be cut up only to be sewn back together again. Technology like the sewing machine also really created a democratization of quilt making as well. So it's really amazing to look at quilts over time and see how these changes have transpired, and how quilt making reflects the culture with that it came from. In the late 20th century up to the current day has now seen the biggest explosion yet in quilt making. Quilt making is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and yet at the same time, most people assume it must be a dying art, that it's still this old-fashioned thing. I think one of the most unique, to kind of get at your question, unique aspects of quilt history is that from almost the very beginning in the United States, quilt making was regarded as old-fashioned, something that was on its way out, because that's what we like about quilts, that they make us feel that we're doing this old-timey thing. And that's how people felt in cities in the 1840s when they had quilting bees and kind of pretended to be old-fashioned colonial women. And that's what happens today as well, even though people are using cutting-edge technologies to do the work.
You mentioned technologies and how it advanced the art of quilt making. Do you think technology is taking away the art of quilt making, or taking away this old-fashioned approach?
Well, I think that the old-fashioned approach is sort of a myth, so I don't see it as taking away anything from that. The one thing I've noticed with some of the new technologies is that there's so much emphasis on precision and this degree of workmanship that you're losing sort of this tactile, comforting quality of the quilt.
You're losing like the process of it, like
right?
The feeling of making it, you know.
To some extent, I was just at the International Quilt Festival in Houston, Texas, and looking through the award-winning quilts, I kept seeing, you know, there's this real emphasis on technical precision, which is amazing. These are fabulous artists. They're fabulous craftspeople. But some of that sort of the creativity that comes from sort of experimentation, and you know, I certainly would dig into my grandmother's scrap bag of fabrics and that sort of thing. Some of that might be missing, and sort of the idea of just making a quilt just because you love to have a quilt, rather than trying to win an award and make sure that you have this technical excellence. I think that there is such a wide range of quilt making going on today in the United States and around the world that we have some of each, and there's room for each. We don't all have to be winning best in show at the International Quilt Festival. I probably won't ever be entering quilts even. I think I'd rather give a quilt as a gift to a friend that has a new baby and not worry if my points of my triangles match up, that it's more the expression of giving that quilt and knowing sort of the symbolic meaning behind the quilt, right?
Yeah, not so much a competition.
Yeah.
Your book, Amish Quilts, Crafting an American Icon. Why would you consider Amish quilts an American icon?
Well, they took on iconic status in the 1970s and 80s, and they really became sort of cult objects. What happened was New York art enthusiasts in the late 60s, early 70s sort of, quote, discovered Amish quilts because they were out tooling around the countryside or seeing them at antique stores or at outdoor markets. And they recognized in Amish quilts a similar aesthetic to the sorts of abstract and minimalist painting that was going on in New York City at that time. So painting by color field painters like like Mark Rothko, Joseph Albers, Barnett Newman, kind of the stripe paintings of artists like Kenneth Noland. And Amish quilts were on a fairly similar scale. You could hang them on a wall in an apartment or a gallery, and they looked a lot like a painting. So this sort of launched this craze for Amish quilts in the 1970s, extending into the 1980s, that eventually they became kind of iconic once they were on U.S. postage stamps, once they were used in the marketing campaigns of companies like Auntie Anne's Pretzels. They became these very recognizable figures. And Amish quilts, at least certain patterns, looked very distinct from the quilts made by non-Amish. That's not true across the board, but there are a few patterns that were fairly distinct to the Amish, and those are the sorts of quilts that became these kind of classic patterns, really recognizable. Absolute Vodka even used a quilt in one of their advertising campaigns because they, for this moment in the 80s in particular, they really reached this sort of elite status as artwork. Also became worth quite a bit of money at that time.
All right, so you have a lot of history with Amish quilts. One of the things I discussed with my partner here, Liam, is the impact of quilts and the Underground Railroads. Can you tell me a little bit about how they relate?
Sure, it's a great question. It's become known now as among the quilt circles as the Underground Railroad Quilt Code. And this was a bit of folklore that's been perpetuated through several publications. Initially, there was a children's book called Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt, and there was also a book called Hidden in Plain View. And both of these books sort of elevated this idea that enslaved African Americans used quilts as part of their way to get to freedom using the Underground Railroad. It's a really pretty amazing story of how you could use sort of an everyday object, use your creativity, ingenuity, usually done by women, sort of an empowering story of women helping their community get to freedom. Unfortunately, we just don't have evidence that actually suggests that this indeed happened. The book Hidden in Plain View, which I mentioned, was based largely on one woman's family lore. And that family may indeed have had this legend that they made quilts to help escape to freedom. But investigation of even that story that this particular woman told included patterns that actually weren't in circulation in the 19th century, included bits of symbolism that probably don't translate well to the antebellum era, that are using contemporary ideas about quilts and applying them retroactively. And the thing is, we also don't have other kind of collaborating evidence. Could be in the form of the extant quilts themselves, or more likely in the form of other narratives, either recorded in text or recorded orally. There were a lot of slave narratives that were recorded in the early 20th century under the auspices of the federal government. The most well-known are part of the Federal Writers Project during the New Deal that interviewed hundreds, thousands of people who grew up in slavery. And they do talk about the Underground Railroad. I think it's important to keep in mind that the Underground Railroad really only helped a very, very small number of people get to freedom in the North. It's one of these amazing stories that our culture has kind of blown into something larger than it actually was, because it's such an amazing tale of seeking freedom out of slavery. But there were only a few paths, and it was often border states that were able to make their way across people living in border states that could make their way across the Mason-Dixon line. But this idea of quilts serving a function in an Underground Railroad has really had a huge appeal to school teachers, to quilt makers, to other people who are interested in celebrating this aspect of American culture. I think it's an amazing part of folklore, but I think it's important to view it as folklore rather than view it as a definitive fact. Folklore and myth are important parts of our culture, just as they were important parts of ancient Greek culture. They help tell us who we are. They help tell us what values we think are important. And that's what this myth does. And I don't think it's dangerous necessarily to continue talking about this myth, but I think it's important to talk about it as folklore rather than as fact. I would say the same thing is true about, talking about Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag. We don't really have that much evidence that she really did that. But her grandson did a really great PR campaign in the late 19th century that celebrated her as the first creator of the American flag as we know it. So does it do any harm to keep perpetuating that story? Hard to say, and there aren't that many women who we can name from the Revolutionary era who did a specific concrete thing, so there's this appeal to it, but we just have to be careful about how we talk about it as a story and as part of folklore rather than part of evidence-based historical narrative.
You mentioned women. Women often are seen as the foundation of quilt making. Do you think that quilt making is confined to just women?
Absolutely not. We can see that right now here in the 21st century more than ever. There are many professional male quilt makers, quilt artists, who have achieved a lot of success in the field professionally. But it's not a new phenomenon of the 21st century either. Before the Industrial Revolution, when textiles were quite expensive, it was largely men, at least in some areas of England, other parts of Europe as well, who were making quilts as professionals, as tailors, rather than as a domestic home craft. And then there certainly have been other examples throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century of male quilt making as well, or often males who would partner with the women in their households to help with quilt making in addition. But there's sort of this interesting kind of cult of the male quilt maker currently going on. There's a number of male artists who have achieved quite large followings, either through social media, through teaching quilt making classes. There was just in this past year a quilt cruise, which is this crazy phenomenon in and of itself, that people pay money to go on quilt-themed cruises. And this was a quilt-themed cruise where all of the quilt-making instructors were men. So it's a significant aspect of quilt-making today. That said, I think quilt-making is very gendered female, and especially through the 19th and much of the 20th century, it has largely been a domestic home craft, and we sort of have celebrated quilt making as one of women's original arts, along with other needle arts, because it fell into this role of the kinds of things that were appropriate for women to do, women who didn't necessarily have other outlets for creative and artistic expression.
In what ways do you think quilts reflect a community or region? Do you see quilts are different in the north, out west, down south? Do they reflect the region that they're made in?
I think historically quilts have indeed often had a very regional connection. As part of the pleasures of studying historic quilt making, I've been able to, see in large numbers these historic antique quilts, as well as many of the state quilt documentation projects that were conducted in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, and these were grassroots documentation projects where there'd be quilt documentation days in a community, and people could bring in their quilts, and there'd be an expert on hand to tell them a little bit about the pattern, help them get the date. And en masse, all of these quilt documentation projects told us a lot about the regional differences among quilt makers. But over time, those regional differences have diminished, which is not a surprise when consumer culture has more of a national reach and quilt making trends are more and more influenced by consumer culture. It's not a surprise that there is sort of more unity, less distinction regionally among quilt making trends. there are some sort of shifts today that I would say perhaps might be like more of a divide between maybe more cities and suburbs and more rural areas. There's a recent movement called the Modern Quilt Guild, Modern Quilt Movement, which modern quilts are inspired by mid-20th century modern design, by Amish quilts, by some of the very utilitarian quilts made by African American and other rural women earlier in the 20th century. And that's an aesthetic that really has caught on somewhat among a younger demographic of quilt makers, but often it's this kind of less conservative visual sensibility that has an appeal there. So I think we can learn a lot about a quilt maker by the style of quilt they make, but less and less of that is specific to regionalism now.
Do you think there's any challenges that quilt makers face today?
Today's quilt industry is experiencing sort of rapid consolidation among many of the large publishing houses that publish patterns and magazines, among some of the fabric companies as well. Some of the smaller independent fabric companies have been bought out by larger companies. Same thing is happening in publishing. And many of the small, locally owned and operated quilt shops, fabric shops, are shuttering because just like other businesses, they can't compete with online sales when you have access to every fabric at a much discounted price compared to going to your local fabric and quilt shop and buying directly from the business person there. What online fabric stores don't have is that community that still exists in many of these small quilt shops, but it's been hard for these small quilt shops to sustain themselves among that kind of competition. So I think quilts, particularly today, but always, or at least since the early 19th century, have really so closely been tied to consumer culture because you're not just buying the fabrics, you're buying all of this other stuff that goes along with it, all of the gear and the gadgets, the fancy sewing machines, the rotary cutters, the templates, the die cutters, all of these things make quilt making, I think, a lot more fun for people, but also really situate it very firmly in this large industry that is about constantly like buying new things. So it's hard to keep up if you really want to have the latest and greatest things all the time. And, you know, how does that make it any different than any sort of other hobby or sort of form of consumer culture where it's a lot of it is about acquiring, even though there's this very creative process that's also taking place.
With the problems that you mentioned that quilt makers face today, what do you think we can do to preserve the history, to preserve the quilts for the future?
Well, I think we need to remember that quilt making today is part of a long tradition, and rather than see it as this separate thing, that if someone makes a double wedding ring quilt today, it is in conversation with all the double wedding ring quilts that have been made over the last century and a half, that it's part of this ongoing process of being inspired and making and remaking and adapting that quilt making has always sort of represented. One thing I would really like to see is the beneficiaries of this large multi-billion-dollar quilt industry would love to see them be real leaders in the effort to preserve quilt making history, not just preserving the quilts themselves, but also the stories of the quilt makers, and to understand the significance that they are just the latest iteration of this long tradition, and that in order to continue this tradition, which helps their bottom line, in fact, you know, if they can keep selling fabrics and sewing machines to a future generation of quilt makers, that will only benefit them, but to understand that it's part of this larger story. I'd love to see, you know, corporations, the corporate leaders in the quilt world, really help us own this heritage. I'm involved in this very small nonprofit. We have a very limited budget. Museums that I've been affiliated similarly are, just able to make do, even though they're doing all this preservation work. I'd like to see it as part of the mission of the corporate side, the industry of the quilt world, to see that as their priority as well.
And last but not least, besides keeping people warm and decorative art, what do you think is the purpose of a quilt? What do you think they symbolically represent?
Well, I think we now associate quilts with all of these very kind of warm, loving qualities of feeling safe, feeling comforted. When tragedy hits far and wide, from when the tsunami hit in Japan 5 years ago, to the aftermath of 9/11, to the AIDS memorial quilt, to the Quilts of Valor project that creates a quilt for every veteran following their stint of duty. Quilts so symbolically are comforting. No matter what they look like, they have this association that's really intimately tied to them. And I think that's why we make quilts for all of these occasions, to memorialize people, to respond to tragedies, because they make us feel safe and they make us feel comforted. And I think quilt makers love the process, no doubt, and they love, this creative expression, but ultimately then having this thing that is tangible, physical representation of feeling safe and comforted is really significant.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Smucker. It was an honor listening to your answers and what perspectives you have on quilt making and quilt history. I look forward to hearing more in future classes, and with that,
Thank you so much.
thank you very much.
My pleasure.